Welcome to our Parsha class. Good to be with you. Just thinking as I was preparing this class, I keep thinking about this one phrase in Pirkei Avot, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought that it sounds like it sounds like a kind of a Zen koan. And I say that as a total ignoramus. Like I know very little about Zen Buddhism, but I do have some sense that that one of their tools is to offer a kind of a teaching which is like strange, a little. There's something about it that doesn't quite make sense, and that there's a riddle, like a kind of a puzzle, and the meditation on the puzzle can bring about sudden enlightenment, right? That's at least, you know, my outsider's understanding. But I was thinking about it when I was preparing this class, because I called this class No Bread, No Torah, and that comes from a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Here, I'll just share it with you so we can see the words of it. And it's sometimes translated as no bread, no Torah, but actually it's im ein kemach. Here, I'll make it bigger. Im ein kemach ein Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah. And then the reverse, if there's no Torah, there's no flour. If there's no flour, there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no flour. That's a teaching of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and it's like the puzzle of it to me is, yeah, okay, if there's no flour, there's no Torah. I mean, you have to eat, right? Like you need the bread to live, and so if you don't have that, forget about the whole project of Torah, of spiritual teaching and so. But it's the inverse teaching, which is a little puzzling and worthy of our meditation. What does it mean to say, if there's no Torah, there's no bread? If there's no Torah, there's no flour. What does that mean? That's not. We're not gonna go into deep analysis. I just want us meditating on that. Just sort of like think about, what does it mean to say, if there's no Torah in the world, then there's no flour in the world, there's no bread in the world, and no sustenance in the world. Okay. A little meditation just to kind of bring our minds into the space. Maybe it'll produce enlightenment. Let's say some blessings to enter into the space. Okay, as we head into ritual, first of all, we counted last night the 32nd day of the Omer. That makes tonight a big night. I won't say what it is because I don't want to count it early, but tonight is a big night, and it means that a lot of the morning practices of the first part of the Omer are released. So next time you see me, I'll be a little less hairy. So it's like haircuts are permitted, among other things, starting tonight. And also, before we say our blessing over Torah, I want this to be a space where this is a space where blessing is that's one of the things we do. Blessing is welcome here. And we have a blessing that we can bring into this space, because Yonatan, who learns with us regularly, Yonatan, last night is in Oklahoma. First of all, Yonatan just had a baby girl. So that's like a huge mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. Feels funny to sing alone, but we're all singing. First of all, he had a baby girl. Unbelievable. Secondly, last night there was a tornado or tornado storm. Yeah, there's like a storm of epic proportions. And I saw pictures this morning. There were holes in the outside furniture, like the hail had burst through the plastic in Norman, Oklahoma. Is that right? And so that's that. Like it looked like the house had been kind of assaulted and by the elements. And so Yonatan is going to say a prayer of thanks to God for safe passage through a dangerous experience, what we call Birkat HaGomel. I think Carrie's going to put it in the chat for us so that you have the words if you want them. Yonatan will recite the first part of will recite the actual blessing, and then we'll recite Mishigmalcha kol tov, huigmalcha kol tov selah. So the words are in there. May the one who granted you goodness continue to grant you goodness. Amen. Okay, is basically the spirit of it. So thank God we have Yonatan. Thank God that we have Hannah, who slept through the night apparently, through the storm. So that seems like a good sign. It's a good siman tov above her head. Okay, so Yonatan, if you want to unmute and say the blessing for us, and then we'll all respond appropriately.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, הגומל חייבים טובות, שגמלני כל טוב.
Amen. Mi shigmalcha kol tuv, hu yigmalcha kol tuv selah. Amen, amen, amen. All right, great. So now let's say our blessing over our Torah study today. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let's get into the matter at hand, and to do so, we are going to be thinking about bread and scarcity and necessity and lack, and we're going to be thinking about all those things. But we're going to get there by doing a little fundamental kind of groundwork, and that is taking a look at chapter 23 of the book of Exodus. Chapter 23 of the book of Exodus is, I would say, one of the most important chapters to kind of make sure you've seen, because it is the hold on, I'm a bad multitasker, and I just want to give you the source sheet here. But chapter 23 in the book of Exodus is the first real calendar that we get in the Torah. Holidays have been mentioned, but this is the first time that we really have a layout of the cycle, the calendar in the Jewish year, and the holiday calendar in particular. And I think it goes without saying that the calendar year is one of the sort of centerpieces of the Jewish experience. So you should remember Leviticus 23 in Parshat Emor. Here, let me give it to you. There. You should remember this and go back to it and just familiarize yourself with it, because you really get a sense of the Torah beginning to lay out a plan for the year. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that plan, because it's just good core fundamental Jewish knowledge. And then we're going to there's a problem in here. We're going to deal with a parshanut problem. There's like a textual oddity, and as usual, that's the kind of thing that will lead us into a whole down a rabbit hole. Okay, in a good way. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at chapter 23 of the book of Leviticus, Parshat Emor, and some of the language even from this parsha will be familiar to us because we borrow from this language when we make kiddush on the holidays, because these are the grand declarations. These are my fixed times, the fixed times of the eternal, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions. Asher tikru otam mikre kodesh. Right, that language is dun 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 dun. You're gonna get a calendar now. Okay, so here we go, and we're gonna tour through the holidays now. What is the most important Jewish holiday? What is the most important Jewish holiday? Everybody should say, because it's like a trick question that a lot of us are familiar with. Most important Jewish holiday is Shabbat. Shabbat, see? Someone knows. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Vicky. So yeah, Shabbat. Shabbat's the most important Jewish holiday. And so the calendar actually begins with Shabbat. These are my fixed times, but every week you're going to have a Sabbath, Shabbat. Okay, and then it's as if to say, okay, but now let's talk about the holidays. Again, these are the set times of the eternal. The word for holidays is different than the word for Shabbat itself, which is moadim, the set times of the eternal. Though the phrase mikra'e kodesh is also used, a proclamation of holiness, sacred occasions, whatever. We won't get too much into that language. But let's just take a quick tour. We're obviously not going to read through the whole chapter, but here we go. In the first month, remember that according to the Torah, Rosh Hashanah is not in September, it's in the spring. So in the first month, there's a Passover offering. And that means the first holiday is, we call it Passover, but the Torah calls it Chag HaMatzot, the festival of matzah, the matzah festival. Okay, so there's Passover. Then we're going to head towards Shavuot, and as some of you know, the movement towards Shavuot is recorded along that's what we're in the middle of now, this counting, a kind of counting of time that marks an agricultural movement, because you see here, just after Passover, you're reaping the harvest and you bring the first sheaf or bundle. That's the Omer. There's the word Omer. So that's what we're in right now. But anyway, we move along. There's lots of details here of what you do in each of these moments that we're not going to take much time of now. But here's the mention of Sfirat HaOmer. You shall count off 7 weeks. Right? There's the language of counting. And now we'll move forward. Again, lots of details. Now, you can see this big bolded line, and I'm just blowing by it, but we'll come back to that. That's our, and I know some of you are going to try and now cheat and study it, and that's ahead of time, and that's fine. But that's what we're going to take a look at this line. But let's keep going for a sec. Okay, then we get Rosh Hashanah. So I didn't even point to Shavuot. But Shavuot is here. On the same day, you shall hold a celebration. It shall be a sacred occasion for you. It's not even called Shavuot. It's the end of this cycle. Okay, it's never mentioned as a holiday. It's just it's the holiday at the end of that counting. Okay, fine. Then, so Passover, then Shavuot, which is a holiday that's coming up in 2 weeks. So, you know, that's why this is all very Inyana Dioma. This is all very, very much happening. So, okay, Shavuot, Passover, Shavuot, here's Rosh Hashanah, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. Here's Yom Kippur, a day of atonement, Yom HaKippurim. And there are only 5 biblical holidays, so we've only got 1 left, and that's the festival of Sukkot. And I say there's 5, but there's really 6, because the 8th day of Sukkot is Shmini Atzeret. Okay, so there you have it. Those are the biblical holidays. Hanukkah, Purim, other things that we now celebrate came later. Chapter 23 told us the biblical holidays. Okay, that's it. So Passover, Shavuot, then the counting of the Omer, the movement through the grain agricultural cycle. Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, which is not called Rosh Hashanah there because it isn't the new year. It's the day of the shofar blowing. Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot, which is a little bit of holiday unto its own. Okay, that wasn't so bad, was it? That was our vegetables. That was our core Jewish knowledge. Okay, it's an important chapter. But this is like such a classic way to like Jewish teaching, 101. But there's something strange in this chapter. There's something weird going on here. And I do think that once you see this line, you'll see, even though all of the holidays have a lot of details. So you could say, later in the chapter, we get the descriptions of what species you bring on Sukkot to shake around. And you get the particular kinds of offerings that you bring for every stage of the grain growing process. Okay, those are details, but there's one that actually doesn't, I think you'll agree, doesn't seem like it belongs in this chapter, one detail. So take a look at it here, and we're going to spend our time today trying to figure out what is going on. Why is this mentioned here? It feels out of place. And here it is. Okay, it's going to scroll back, just so we see where it goes. There's Shabbat, there's Passover, there is the grain process beginning. And now let's talk a little more about grain. You reap its harvest and you bring the first sheaf of harvest to the priest. And then you keep going and counting. That's what we're doing now, until you get enough new grain that you can make bread. I didn't bold it here in the English, but I bolded it in the Hebrew. Lechem, lots of bread talk. Lechem, all this bread is part of the offering on Sukkot. This is Sukkot. I should Probably. I knew that would happen. That's my least favorite thing about Sefaria. But I want to bold this just so we see, okay, yeah, this is a holiday too. This is, sorry, I just said Sukkot. That's wrong. Shavuot. This is Shavuot. Okay, but it's not called Shavuot. It's just the day at the end of this whole counting process when you're bringing these new offerings now in the form of loaves of bread. Okay, great. And you have a holiday, so you don't work. This is a law for all time in all your settlements throughout the ages. That's good enough. And we should move on to Rosh Hashanah, except we have this line here. And this is the line that we're going to try to figure out what it's doing here. And when you reap the harvest of your land, because that's what you're doing on Shavuot, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Eternal, am your God. Okay? Read it in Hebrew. Uvekutzrechem et ktsir artzechem lo techale pa'at sadcha ubekutzrecha v'leket ktsircha lo telaket le'ani v'lager ta'azovotam ani Adonai Elohechem. Okay? Now, what's that doing? And then on to Rosh Hashanah. What? This is not. Now, I know there's a relationship, right? I was sort of talking about similar things, but this doesn't belong here. This is a different law. This is not the calendar laws. This is not the holiday laws. And in fact, we know that. We know that because we just saw this law a few chapters earlier. This was part when we got a legal code in chapter 19 of Leviticus. We already got this law. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Eternal, am your God. So it's almost like this teaching, it's already happened. It's a different law, and it gets taken and like lifted and imported into this chapter right after the mention of Shavuot. So the question now that I have for you is, what's it doing there? What's going on? Why is this teaching here? Or does someone want to disagree with me and say, no, of course it belongs there because what? Noah?
I can argue both sides, one that it fits and one that it doesn't fit. For the one that I believe it fits, it's coming right after we're hearing about Pesach, the Omer, and Shavuot. So then it gets to the second time it mentions the Peah for the poor. And it can fit because the poor and those who live among us need to have the food. So without the food, how can they even think of celebrating if they're only thinking of survival? Which it's and that's for why I believe it fits there and why it does.
So let's just start making note of possible interpretations. One interpretation Noah offers is it's there because you're going to need to offer some grain at this holiday. How are poor people going to do it? They need to be able to participate in the holiday too. Okay, so we need to just mention, it's still a little odd, like in the middle of the calendar. Oh, and don't forget about the poor. I mean, it's nice, but it's just like, okay, yeah, I guess it makes the holiday doable for some, and the Torah is concerned with that. The Torah, although we did already mention that, but okay. You want to take the other side, Noah?
Yeah, and on the other side, we obviously heard it in the last chapter, and that should have been enough, but for it not really fitting, it was mentioned already. Why do we need a second verse? So it can't only be teaching us about Peah. For this is sort of relevant, but it's also teaching us that even if it's mentioned back there in all the laws, we can learn something else from Peah that's not about the calendar per se, but about how we should be treating the poor among us and not forgetting them. It's not technically about the calendar, but it sort of is.
Okay, great. So Noah, beginning to offer us perhaps a deeper, like a more ethical kind of reflection here that we, okay, and I want to just say, Noah keeps mentioning peah. Peah means the corner of the field. There are three standard agricultural practices for setting aside food for the poor. There's peah, leaving a whole corner, a place where the poor can come and pick food off of, or grains off of the side of the harvest. There's leket, which is when you're gathering grains, whatever falls out of your hands belongs to the poor. And then there's shicha, which is, and also if you leave anything behind when you've done all the gathering, if you just forgot anything, you can't, once you left the field, that belongs to the poor. So those are the terms, and you may hear some people mentioning them, but those are the three institutions. We taught them before, they're great, but Noah now is wondering, is there some way that the calendar is saying, is something you need to know around Shavuot, or something you need to think about during this process? Yeah, we taught that law, but think about it. I want you to think about it now. There's some reason the Torah wants us to meditate on that, on the place of the poor in our society again. Okay, Payam?
I think it's there to future-proof the holiday. I mean, if we're honest, nobody even knows what Shavuot really is. If you ask like even your shul-going Jew, like, what is Shavuot? I mean, most people don't know what it is. So, but if you look at like, they ask them like, what's Rosh Hashanah? They blow the shofar. Sukkot is the festival of booths. Pesach has matzah. So I mean, it's pretty inherent in itself what it is. But with Shavuot, you don't really know what it is, and especially for moving away from agriculture economy. So if you add in this section of, okay, this is the reason we have Shavuot is because, you give it a purpose. You give it a symbolism, in essence, of the four corners and helping the poor, then okay, that's what the holiday is for.
Okay, that's an even stronger claim, that interpretation that there is, Shavuot is a little bit of a missing holiday, or a holiday missing meaning. Like, it just seems to be the culmination of an agricultural cycle in the Torah. Later, the rabbis will insist and figure out and decide and start celebrating Shavuot as the day of the revelation at Mount Sinai. That's how we celebrate it now. Like, we got the Torah on Shavuot, but it's as if Payam is saying that Shavuot is already, it's begging for some kind of content in the Torah, and the Torah is providing it, saying, okay, yeah, and at the end of all of this, this might actually be a holiday that is for remembering the poor. That might actually be central to what Shavuot is all about. Okay, here we're really starting to get into some deeper interpretation and analysis, and I'm going to soon take us into a similar kind of exploration in the traditional commentaries. So let's take a couple more thoughts, and then we'll head in. I saw Matt and then Florine.
What comes to my mind here about, in terms of this being an inset in terms of the calendar, is that during the plagues, we have a calendar insert to the narrative. We're about to get the 10th plague, and all of a sudden they stop and say, okay, on this date, we want you to remember this. So there is, I'm sort of speculating. I've moved to that level, but there's some sort of trying to really connect calendar observances and things that happen. It's pulling those two. It's not just do this thing, but these things are deep and important. And it's sort of the same. Yeah. It's the same kind of weirdness.
So Matt is saying right now, Matt is saying a very deep thing. Let me just try it and re-articulate it a little bit, because I think it's really important to keep in mind what Matt is saying, which is that the Torah is constantly using time and the movement through time and established patterns of movement through time as a vehicle for thinking about story, right? So it's pretty clear that there's an earlier system of pilgrimage festivals that the Torah is aware of, where you make a pilgrimage or you have festivals, at least harvest festivals. Forget about pilgrimage, that's maybe later. But there's the spring holiday, the cutting harvest holiday, and then the end of the cycle, which is, and the Torah initially, when it mentions Passover, says Chag HaMatzot, the Passover, the festival of matzah, because we just went through this experience, and then also celebrate the harvest festival and the gathering festival. Only later did the gathering festival becomes the Sukkot festival, the living in huts festival, and Shavuot, like not quite there, but Matt is saying, but you can feel the Torah doing this all the time. The Torah is saying, oh, let's take this system and infuse it with meaning from our story. That's important. Okay, so maybe it's not so surprising to see the Torah doing that in real time. Okay, let's make sure the end of this agricultural holiday means something. That's pretty good. Okay, Florine.
If Shavuot is the receiving of the Torah, to me, it implies that I join the movement, the path of the Torah, and I join the movement of creation in terms of completing creation and protecting creation. And I carry forth the momentum of the purpose of being here, which is to do good and bring joy. And so for me, this statement is just part of that movement of receiving Torah. It's just a logical thing that happens.
Love that. Love that. I love like hearing how you're already, I mean, in some ways, we hardly need to go dive into the commentaries. We're already getting there. We're already getting to this sort of symbolic thinking that I think is so characteristic of our tradition of interpretation. Shavuot it eventually becomes revelation. And it's about Torah. It's about the giving of the Torah. So what does the giving of the Torah have to do with the care for the most vulnerable? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. You know what I mean? Everything. That's it. That's the whole thing. We were slaves in Egypt, right? So don't forget that language of the stranger ger, you make sure to provide for the ger. That's Exodus language. So Shavuot is going to be, remember that. Tune into that. Okay. Let's see. I want to just keep taking thoughts, but I also want to show you this. Let's just take a minute to dive into the commentaries, because as I said, we're beginning to sound a lot like them. So let's just, I want to start slow by taking a look at the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra is one of our kind of two most classic commentators, the most being Rashi, the Ibn Ezra right after Rashi. And the Ibn Ezra is a sort of, was an itinerant preacher, but Spanish in origin. And he's known for a very straightforward, Rashi is flowery and the Ibn Ezra tries to cut right to the heart of the matter. And his first answer sounds a lot like Noah's first answer. The answer we'll see first sounds a lot like Noah's first answer, and that is the answer from the Ibn Ezra, who says the reason for mentioning, and when you reap the harvest of your land a second time, because it was after all mentioned in Leviticus 19, is that Shavuot is the festival of the first fruits and of the wheat harvest. So the Torah cautions, do not forget what I commanded you to do at this time. In other words, it's pretty straightforward, right? We're talking about harvesting, right? Where are we? The whole thing, the whole process of moving from Passover to Shavuot is a process of harvesting grains. Remember, by the way, that we start on Passover with matzah and we end on Shavuot with bread. There's actually a very granular, if you will, granular kind of theme running through this. But it's harvest, And so the Torah is like, well, don't forget what I said about harvest. Harvest doesn't just happen, not even on the holiday. Not even on the, don't you think it's a holiday and you don't have to do this? No, you still have to take care of the poor, which is a good answer. The Ibn Ezra is right. That's a good way to read. Oh, the Torah is moving. It mentioned harvest. Oh, don't forget what I said before. But again, I find that, as I said to Noah, I find that answer it's a little bit of a funny, that's like a funny way to imagine the Torah's narrative. Like every once in a while saying and I'd like to remind you, here's a callback to a few chapters before. I mean, that's a legitimate read, but I want something deeper. I want something more like what Florine was just giving us. All right. So let's take a look. And for something deeper, for a parallel to some of the comments that were emerging at the end there, we're going to take a look at the Meshech Chochma. And the Meshech Chochma is Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, Latvia. Cool. Not every day you study a Latvian thinker, right? That's cool. Okay. As 20th century thinker, early 20th century thinker, and it's really he wrote a masterpiece commentary, and it's known for being like a chassid, like a kind of a Hasidic style commentary for non-Chassids. He was not a Chassid, but he seemed to be influenced by it, and so his explanations were often like much bigger and more spiritual and sort of big vision kind of comments than the more straightforward style of the Middle Ages that we saw with the Ibn Ezra. So let's take a look at the Meshech Chochma. I want us to throw this analysis into our discussion because I think it's quite powerful. Look at what he suggests here. He says that, okay, here's the Meshech Chochma, early 20th century. We must know that the giving of the Torah on Shavuot, so he's right there with Florine. It's Shavuot, and the Ibn Ezra also. Both of them are assuming, look, this is Shavuot, and it has to do with the giving of the Torah. So the giving of the Torah, he says, was not only for the religious rituals. Lo haya rak ala chukim. The Torah was not just given for random religious laws, but also for the most reasonable practices. Ki'im al hanimusim hamuskalim. It's an unusual phrase there. Hanimusim hamuskalim. Not just for the religious rituals, but also for the most reasonable practice, such as kindness to the poor and the stranger. And this is really his big point, for without faith in God, the human being becomes like a savage beast, showing no pity even on their own parents. That's just his example of what it means to be a savage beast. Therefore, it says that on the festival of Shavuot, you should celebrate the giving of the Torah, not just for the chukim, religious rituals, but also for the rational precepts. And here it's the language a little different. Hamusagim basechel, those things which the mind can understand and reach and reason out. For they too are only made possible because I am the Lord your God. Remember, that's the phrase that we ended with in both instances of I, the eternal, am your God. Okay? So, all right, let's try to understand this. Now, he says, it's important for you to know that the giving of the Torah, the reason this is here is the giving of the Torah is not just for religion and not just for chukim, which are, okay, what are chukim? Let's define that. Chukim, what's an example of a chok? Anyone? A chok? It's hard to do these gimme questions on Zoom, right? No one wants to like unmute just to be like, kashrut. But kashrut is an answer. Keeping kosher. According to our tradition, it's not because it's healthy but it's just like God said so. There are certain things we just do. That's just being Jewish. What are you going to do? You do weird stuff. You know what I mean? It's like a particularistic stuff, identity stuff, religious stuff. There's no particular, nobody would decide to keep kosher randomly. It's because the Torah said so. That's chukim. The ultimate chok is the red heifer, right? Things that are just sort of weird, mysterious. Use the ashes of a red heifer to purify, someone who has had contact with the dead. Whoa, sounds like hocus pocus, but it's a chok. Chok. Maybe that's where hocus pocus comes from. No. There are all those attempts to like derive all languages from Hebrew. So anyway, okay, distracted. Okay, so what's this other category? What's this, the reasonable practices, hanimusim hamuskalim, that you need the Torah also to tell you about. Okay, let's try to just understand, what is the Meshech Chochmah saying here? It's like, there's something the Torah is doing here. What is the Torah doing for us? I'm going to turn to Yonatan. Do you have a thought on this? I see hands up from before, so I'm not sure now who to call on. If you put a hand up and then you decide, I actually don't have anything to say anymore because we've moved on, it's good to take the hand down just so we don't see it. Then I know who to call on. But I'm going to call on Yonatan right now.
I mean, we've moved on a bit, but I hope it's still relevant. The kind of like you said, the currency of the whole trajectory from Passover to Shavuot is grain, right? It's very much a grain holiday, and one of the two passages where we have Shavuot, in fact, dates it to when you start harvesting grain, right? And we have a commandment about eating grain, prohibiting us from eating grain prior to the grain sacrifice. And I want to kind of proffer that this verse shows us that the holiness of Shavuot is not the day itself. In fact, prior to the fixing of the Hebrew calendar, it wasn't a set day, but rather it's this whole period, and that this is a commandment of that period. Just the same as the temple sacrifices and everything else that came with these holidays that we're getting. Here's one more thing that you are commanded to do during this time of the Omer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Yonatan wants us just to really think, not just to see this harvest as sort of like in the background as we tend to do now that we're in the kind of like, we're not farmers, most of us, and most Jews, right? But let's not forget, that's what it was, a harvest, agricultural, in the fields. And so Peah is not just a callback, it's part of the practice of this holiday. It's fundamental in the way that shaking a lulav is fundamental on Sukkot. The Peah, and Yonatan is saying both a very simple and a very deep thing. Like, of course, it's happening. That's what the Ibn Ezra said. You have to remember that it's happening. But Yonatan is saying, yeah, and it's an integral part of the holiday. This is one of the mitzvot of the holiday. That's good. Jen Snow?
I guess I was going back to the thing at the top with, if there's no flour, there's no Torah, and if there's no Torah, there is no flour, and that if the giving of the Torah, I mean, if you want everyone to be involved and to be able to worship, they're not going to be able to worship if they have no sustenance. And so isn't then one of the commandments that, I mean, to me, it made sense that the part about the giving to the poor was there, because it just makes sense. Everyone will not be able to accept the Torah if everyone doesn't have sustenance. If everyone's
good. This echoes, I think, what Payam suggested, that you kind of need this institution in order to, like, for the poor to do this. But Jen is saying, no, but the message is larger. It's that you need sustenance in order for any of this to happen. The whole, it really is a basic, remember that we all need to be subsisting at a basic eating in order to do this religion. So that is actually maybe the message of Shavuot. And that is, again, I'm kind of trying to probe what we just heard in the Meshech Chochmah, this commentary of Rabbi Meir Simcha, that the Torah, the giving of the Torah, it's about religion. It's about the random, particular, cool stuff that makes us Jews, but it's also about all of the other stuff that is so fundamental to just being a human community. But what does the Meir Simcha say? But you need to be told to do that. Because otherwise, if you don't do it, if you are not told to do it, if you're not commanded to do it, then you just end up behaving like savages. You won't care for your parents, and you won't care for the poor. Okay? All right. Jen, Bailey Guerra.
I think, this is celebrating a moment where the Torah is given to everyone, all the people, and it's promising land that belongs to the people. It's not the land of the individual. It's the land of Israel. The relationship with God is not an individual relationship necessarily, it's a collective relationship. And one of the things that this is doing is reminding you, you may own the land from which you are harvesting and making sacrifices, but it's not really just your land. It doesn't really just belong to you. It belongs to all of the people. And this is one of the ways of ritualizing and remembering that the covenant is not just individual, it's collective. And so too is the land that's being promised through the covenant.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Thank you, Jen. And I would like to pair that with Yonatan's comments earlier, because Yonatan says it's part of the whole season. You're in the fields. You got to always be this sectioning some off for the poor, sectioning some off for the poor. And I think what Jen's comments can overlay onto that is a sense that, yeah, because the whole thing with farming, the whole thing with being in that mode is remembering this is just a blessing from God. I don't own the land. On a deep level, I don't own the land. And that's an undercurrent, a deep message that the Torah sees, not just be compassionate to the vulnerable. That's one of the great messages of the Torah, but also you don't really own anything. God is in charge of everything. So like you're in your harvest festival, you're going to celebrate. Look at what I grew this year with the land that God gave me. Whoa, 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 whoa. You know, God didn't just give it to you. God gave it to everybody. And sometimes you got to redistribute because some people don't have enough, right? Okay, yeah, that's I like where we're heading here, but I still want to like probe a little further into this idea that we need to be told and commanded and ordered by God to take care of the poor, or else we wouldn't. It's just like, okay, let's see. I'm going to continue to circle. Allison.
Yay. So I think this idea that we need to be commanded, otherwise we would not give to the poor, I think it has to do, maybe it's a teaching about how we need to relate to God, you know, because we have all of these holidays that sort of celebrate, well, you know, like starting with Passover, that celebrate like Hashem kind of choosing us, making us his people, like taking us out, like giving us these things. And then Shavuot is like the giving of the Torah, you know. And maybe if we weren't commanded to leave the corners of the field, to like leave the droppings behind, maybe we would have sort of a greedy orientation. You know, that's sort of like when he says that you would disrespect your parents. Like, what is it to disrespect your parents? It's to really elevate yourself and make yourself like sort of like too important. Like I'm thinking of, you know, how Republicans sometimes say like, we built this, I built this. And I always think, what arrogance, you know, what arrogance that you built this. There's an entire system that was set up for you. Property rights and highways and, you know, a postal system, you know, how dare you say that? And I think that maybe there's something in human nature that makes us want to say, I built this, you know, because we do put labor in to cultivating things, to building things. And yet it's not only our labor. Like John Locke famously, you know, like the foundation of our like property rights, like Locke says, how do you make something your private property? You mix your labor with the gifts of God, right? And so I think it's sort of a reminder. That's why it's important that it be brought up, like in all of these different festivals, because it's like, okay, these are the festivals that you celebrate, and by the way, this is how you have to orient yourself towards them.
Good,
you know?
good. So these comments, I think, expand. We saw like the way Jen's comments sort of built on Yonatan's or related to Yonatan's, and Allison in some ways takes that line of thinking yet a step further and says, forget about even land for a minute. These commandments end with Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am the eternal your God, and that constant refrain and the appearance of it here is like there's something much bigger than any other message happening here, which is it's not about you. It's not about you. It's about God. It's about something other outside of yourself. It's not you and your accomplishments and don't be, Allison says, don't be caught up in your ego, in your arrogance. You know, I want to say this, I almost want to say, like, you know, they're very arrogant people on both sides, you know, but lahavdil. But yeah, but you know, like it's a human problem. It's a human problem. Like we have to monitor this. That might be the point of religion. The point of religion is to not be thinking about yourself. That's a very core message. And maybe Shavuot is the time to think about that message, because Shavuot is the time when we receive revelation and we get this message, and what's the point of this all? The point of this all is that it's not about you. It's about service. It's about the great human society. It's about the world. It's about God and creation. It's something other than just like you and your accomplishments. Okay, I'm starting to feel like so panicked because I'm not going to be able to get to everyone. But let's take a comment from Kathy, and then we'll look at one last text together.
Okay, so one of my concerns in this is going back to that Meshach Chochmah guy. That on the one hand, he's saying, okay, so there are two bases for doing things. So the hukim that just come from God, and then there's the most reasonable practices. And then he says that, but without faith in God, you can't have that. But the thing is that it seems to me that there is a basis that doesn't have to do with God, and it's reason. You know, that those are the reasonable things to do, and that someone who looks at it, if you don't need God to be, to have reason, you can think it through in a kind of a reasonable, kind of ethical way, like, do you want this kind of society, that sort of thing. So it seems to me that tie saying, oh, the reasonable ones have to come from God. No, it seems to me that the unreasonable ones have to come from God because they don't have any other basis. So I just find that kind of a bit of a paradox that actually, you could have a reasonable system that doesn't have God in it. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that that's not the way it's worked out empirically. And I've often said that, like I would have been fine with, sort of dealing with all of these things without God or without religion per se. But you tend not to have people organized with kind of philosophical congregations. It just doesn't happen that way. And I'm sort of puzzled why people can't just come together, sort of without God, but in fact, we don't. And in fact, then it also gets me back to, like the Sefirot, actually reason and wisdom are at the very top of the Sefirot and sort of the least accessible to us.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there because that gets us into Kabbalah. So that's like, Kathy's like, it's just holding on such a high level here. Kathy, I just love learning with you. I feel like we're like, how many times have you graciously like set me up exactly for where I needed to go? It's just like, I feel like this tremendous sync with you, but Kathy takes us exactly where I wanted to go next, which is exactly right. There's something strange about the Meshech Chochmah's formulation. Something strange about it, which is that he says there are these religious rituals. Of course, you need God to say, hey, I'd like you to keep kosher. I know it sounds weird, but do it anyway. But then he says, and then there are the reasonable practices, which you also need God to tell you to do. But that doesn't make sense. Like, isn't the whole idea that you can reason your way to those practices? And in fact, Kathy is right there with the whole of Jewish tradition before this, with the Talmud's original formulation, distinguishing between two categories of law, chukim, which we've talked about, these like sort of arbitrary but religious precepts, and then mishpatim. And here's Maimonides giving exactly the sort of distinction that Kathy just offered. and giving some place to to reasonable laws that you can get to even without God. Okay, so take a look at this. This is the classic formulation. Chukim and mishpatim, two categories of law, and here's so we just saw the Meshech Chochmah distinguishing between chukim, he uses that word, and then reasonable practices, which is a new term, nimusim hamuskalim. Okay, but Maimonides uses the old term. The mishpatim, he says, are the commandments whose reasons are obvious, and the benefit of their being performed in this world is known. Everybody knows that, such as the prohibition against stealing and murder and honoring one's father and mother. I think we can all agree, says Maimonides, any reasonable society would eventually come up with a law that you don't kill people or steal from people. Interesting, by the way, that he also says honoring father and mother, since in the Meshech Chochmah's formula, that was an example of something you wouldn't do naturally. But we're just like, let's hold for a second. Maimonides' medieval paradigm, you would do those things. Every society does those things. Look around. Thou shalt not kill is not like the Torah. It's everywhere, right? So here's Maimonides again. Maimonides says, so mishpatim are the things that everyone would, they're obvious. The chukim are those commandments whose reasons are unknown. Our sages have said, I ordained decrees and you have no license to question them. A person's natural inclination does question them, and the nations of the world challenge them. Like all the other people, like, why are you keeping kosher? That's stupid. But because it doesn't make sense. For example, the prohibition of the meat of a pig. There's the example I'm using. Oh yeah, it's like, why mixing milk and meat? Lots of kosher laws, right? He's thinking where I'm thinking, or really I'm thinking where he was thinking. A calf whose neck is broken, that's like a particular ritual. The red heifer, which I said is the ultimate chok. And the goat sent to Azazel, the goat that bears, or the scapegoat that bears our sins on Yom Kippur. These don't make any sense. These are like mystical. These are beyond comprehension. But there are all of these things that do make sense, and that, as Kathy said, we don't need God for those things. We don't need Torah for those things. The human mind can figure out that a society works best when we don't kill, don't steal, honor our parents, and maybe take care of the poor, right? We got to take care of the poor. They can't have people walking around starving. So what then is the Meshech Chochmah's, like Meshech Chochmah seem to be coming up with another category, right? It's like the things that don't make any sense, chukim. Then there's the things that do make sense, and a society will tend to have those things, those laws. Like basic society structure is, let's like try to stop violence. So don't kill. Every society is going to have that law. But then there's another category. The category of things which are reasonable. Human mind can see them and appreciate them and say, yes, that's important. Of course you should honor your mother and father. But we don't do it. We don't naturally do it. A society, and let's put it in the terms of society, a society doesn't naturally create a law that says you have to honor your mother and father. And more to the point of our discussion here, a society, and we know this all too well, do we not, does not naturally and inevitably take care of the poor. Even though it makes sense. You don't want people dying in the streets, but a society doesn't do that. Society will always have the cops and the military and the base and the sanitation, the things that just like, you gotta just need that in order to keep some kind of order. But there's another category, says the Meshech Chochmah, of these other very reasonable practices, but they're not usually laws. They're just ethics, good ways of being. And the Torah is coming in to say, no, these are laws. You have to do these things, and you wouldn't do them if I didn't tell you to, right? Everybody knows that this is good, and nobody does it. So that's another category of law. Everybody knows, nobody would know this, so I have to tell you. There's everybody knows this and everybody does it. all societies. And then there's the Torah wants to mandate things that everybody knows are good, but nobody does them. Okay, we're almost out of time, but that idea that there are laws that there are things which we all agree on, and yet nobody's doing anything about them, reminded me of the famous telegram that Abraham Joshua Heschel sent to President Kennedy, because he uses very, very similar language. And I want to read it to you as we close here. Very, very powerful piece of history here. It's 1963, and he says, he's writing in anticipation of a meeting that he's been invited to for religious leaders. And he says, I look forward to, this is say the privilege. Oh no, actually, maybe it's a telegram. And I think it's just privilege of. I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. Telegram language. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. That's the Meshech Chochmah right there. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement and not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogues have failed. They must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Personal sacrifice. Think about what we do when we set aside that corner of the field. Personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare a state of moral emergency. A state of moral emergency. And everybody talks about it and nobody does anything about it. And that, says the Meshech Chochmah and Heschel, is why the Torah has to come and insist that even though you think it's a good idea and everybody agrees it's such a nice value, you have to do this. We have to consecrate this into law and make it a part of your calendar, of your holiday, of your Torah, right? So that we actually take care of each other, right? So that we don't just have a working society, but a good society. So I wish us a good society. I wish us a better society as we head towards Shavuot. Let's celebrate the Torah of our religion, of our chukim, but also the Torah of a basic recognition of human dignity. All right, great learning with you all.